So, hey, y'all, let's talk about one of the most jaw dropping, game changing, and what is happening moments of the Cold War. Nixon buddying up with Communist China. Sounds normal now, but honey, back then it was a full on scandal. We're talking about a country that had spent 2 decades helping to arm and fund groups fighting against the U.S. in our containment wars, Korea, Vietnam, you name it. And suddenly Nixon's over there smiling for pictures with their leader? Oh, we need to unpack this tea because the backstory, it's messy, it's dramatic, and it's full of Cold War pettiness. Okay, first things first, why were the US and China not even on speaking terms for 2 whole decades? Buckle up. In 1949, China went full communist when Mao Zedong and his Communist Party took over after a brutal civil war. The US had backed the other side, the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai shek. But spoiler alert, they lost. Chiang and his followers fled to the island of Taiwan, claiming, hey, we're still the real Chinese government. And the US? They went all in on back in Taiwan, refusing to even acknowledge that Communist China existed. But Cold War drama alert, the US literally blocked Communist China from taking China's seat at the United Nations and handed it to Taiwan instead for decades. Meanwhile, China was out here helping North Korea fight against American troops in the Korean War, sending weapons and supplies to Vietnam to fight against the US in the Vietnam War, and they were besties with the Soviet Union, at least for a little while. So, yeah, things were frosty. Fast forward to 1971, and China and the Soviet Union, not exactly besties anymore. Mao was not vibing with how the Soviets were running the Communist Club, and tensions between them were high. Meanwhile, Nixon sees an opportunity. If he could get China on his side, he could make the Soviet Union sweat a little. And how do you start mending fences after 2 decades of pure hostility? Well, apparently, you send over some ping pong players. Yes, ping pong. This was huge. The two countries had barely even spoken, and now suddenly China was inviting American athletes over for a friendly game of table tennis? Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, saw the opportunity and took it. They sent word back to China, yes, this ping pong thing is cute, let's talk. And China, they were down. So, just a year after the ping pong diplomacy, Nixon does the unthinkable. He flies to Communist China. Communist China. This is the same country that fought against the US in Korea and Vietnam, has been labeled as a communist menace for decades, that the US has refused to recognize diplomatically. And yet, here's Nixon in Beijing shaking hands with Chairman Mao. I cannot stress enough how earth-shattering this was. Why was it such a flex? Well, it freaked out the Soviets. Suddenly their communist rival was getting chummy with the US. It opened the door for diplomatic and trade relations, and spoiler, China is now a global economic powerhouse. And it made Nixon look like a master strategist, even though he'd soon be famous for something way worse. Watergate. Okay. And let's not forget, the US still backed Taiwan at this point. Nixon wasn't switching sides completely yet. But this was one step in the slow process of recognizing Communist China over Taiwan. Okay, so while Nixon was off making new friends in China, he also decided to stop the US and the Soviet Union from stockpiling nukes like they were Black Friday deals. Enter SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. This was the first real attempt to slow down the nuclear arms race. So what SALT I did is it put a cap on nuclear weapons, finally. And it also showed that the US and USSR could actually agree on something, and it made Détente, this whole let's chill out strategy, look like it might actually work. Spoiler, it did not last. So, after all this global mingling and treaty signing, along comes the Helsinki Accords, which was basically a massive group project on world peace. And honey, you already know some members weren't pulling their weight. 35 nations, including the US and the Soviet Union, gathered in Helsinki, Finland, and made all these official sounding promises. We're going to respect existing borders. We're going to promote cooperation between East and West, and we're going to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. The West, especially the US, was like, yes, finally, the Soviets are agreeing to basic human decency. But the USSR, they signed it and then immediately treated it like the terms and conditions on a website, clicked accept, and never read it again. They continued to censor the press, imprison their political dissidents, and treat human rights part like a cute suggestion, not a rule. Meanwhile, American activists, especially in groups like the Helsinki Watch Committees, started using the Accords to call out Soviet human rights abuses. So, takeaway from this, the US tried to turn Helsinki into a receipts folder for Soviet bad behavior. The Soviets? They just wanted to keep their Eastern Empire legit and didn't care about being called out. And just when you thought Détente might survive the Cold War chaos, boom, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. They roll in with tanks in December of 1979 to prop up a friendly communist government. The US reaction? Picture a breakup text in all caps. How dare you? We were doing so well. Don't ever talk to me again. Here's how the US really responded. We cut off all grain exports to the USSR. No wheat for you, Ivan. Started arming Afghan rebels to fight the Soviets on the ground. Spoiler alert, one of the groups that benefited from this aid later morphed into the Taliban. Yeah, that one. We boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics. No gymnastics, no track, no Cold War medals. And we launched a defensive spending spree because Détente was out and flexing was back in. And that SALT II treaty that was supposed to keep things civil, never ratified, ghosted, gone. Détente was pronounced officially dead. Alright, so what's the takeaway? Détente was Nixon and Kissinger's master plan to ease Cold War tensions. China had spent decades actively fighting against U.S. interests, but Nixon saw an opportunity to flip the script. Ping pong diplomacy opened the door, and Nixon walked right in. The SALT Treaty and the Helsinki Accords tried to keep things cool, but the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan blew it all up. So, was Détente brilliant diplomacy or just delaying the inevitable? That's the real tea. What do you think? Spill your tea in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Cold War drama. Bye.